Hello, everybody, and welcome again. I feel a little bit like a baseball or a football announcer. I've got the microphone here in front of me, but hopefully the volume will be good for everybody to hear. If not, let me know and we'll try something different. Again, I'm trying to give you all an extra outside the textbook opportunity to figure out some stuff. But today what I'd like to do is talk about some words that are popular in the Bible that we take for granted today, but meant something different, I think, to the people in the first century. The three words I'm going to be talking about today are euangelion, which we get evangelism from, or the gospel, the good news, the word apostle, and then the word baptism. And these are all words that had a very secular meaning before Christianity came along. I mean, they were words that were in common usage in the first century and had absolutely no Christian meaning. Christians came along and adopted these secular words and sort of baptized them and then turned them into words that are very, very important to Christianity. But I want you all to understand how someone just hearing about Christianity in the first century would have experienced these words, because they didn't carry any Christianity connotation when just a normal person in the first century heard them. First word I want to talk about is this euangelion, or gospel, or good news. And when Paul is talking about the gospel or the good news, he uses this word euangelion. You may be familiar with it from sermons. But it had a very secular meaning, and the evangelist, or the person spreading the euangelion, or the good news in the first century, was very often someone paid by Caesar to go out and announce things to the empire. So Caesar would actually hire and authorize a number of these evangelists, if you let me put quotes around the word, to go out. And typically what would happen is when Caesar had a child or a son, or when there was an important military victory or something like that, he would pay these reporters or announcers to go out to spread the good news. And the good news would be this guy would come to town, everybody would gather around, and he would say, "I have come with the gospel," or the good news. God, Caesar, has had a son. Because remember, at this time there is no separation between church and state. The state is a church, the church is the state, and the head of the state is Caesar, who was often seen as a god. Now, before Nero, typically they waited until Caesar died to make him a god. Safer that way. You don't want a live god running around. But after Nero, it became more and more prevalent that the Caesar, or the emperor, would force people to address him as God. Now, by the time you get to Domitian, Domitian demanded that he be addressed as Lord and God. And if he didn't, he killed you. Pretty simple. So when we talk about the original meaning of gospel, or euangelion, or good news, it is that God, Caesar, has had a son, and everybody rejoices because God has had a son and the future of the kingdom is secure. Now, given that secular background, you can see how it really is a politically and religiously loaded statement when Paul comes preaching the good news, but he's talking about a king who is not Caesar. So this is not necessarily only a religious statement, this is a political statement, and if you were a good Roman, you would hear it as seditious and unpatriotic. So the good news at its heart was a very, very confrontational and powerful message. So when Paul talks about the good news, he is saying, yes, God has had a son. Yes, the kingdom of God is here, but your understanding of who God is incorrect and needs to be reinterpreted on the basis of this. So every time you hear good news, understand that requires a religious and political decision on the people who are hearing that response. And you start to understand a little bit better why Paul talks so much about the power of the good news, because it's different from what people normally expect when someone comes to town talking about the good news. Second word I want to talk about is apostle. Now, we think about this word today, and we think about sometimes big A apostle or little a apostle, but all apostle really is a transliteration of a Greek word, apostolos. Now, when I say transliteration, I mean we take a Greek letter and we turn it into an English letter, take the second Greek letter, turn it into a second Greek letter. So the original Greek word is apostolos, and it means one who is sent. But we based on 2,000 years of history, we think about this in terms of perhaps a Paul or Peter or somebody like that. But we forget the original meaning, and the original meaning was probably closer to what we would consider an ambassador to be. Now think about an ambassador. He's someone who the president or the king or the leader or whatever picks. So that's the ambassador is directly authorized with the mission by the king or the president or something like that, goes to a foreign country, represents the original country in that foreign country, and is empowered with the full power of the president or the king to make decisions. And again, in the first century, the most perfect ambassador would be the son of the king, because the son would embody all the representation of the king. So when we think about Peter or Paul or John or one of the apostles or something like that, start thinking about the idea of ambassador, because apostle really means nothing more than just a transliterated Greek word. But when we start thinking about ambassador, we start thinking about power, we start thinking about authority, we start thinking about mission. And then the last thing we think about when the ambassador is done, he goes back to the person who sent him and reports on all that he's done. And if you think about how Paul acts, very much fulfills that role of ambassador. And if you think about how we are supposed to act today as Christian witnesses exercising the Great Commission, we are ambassadors too. We have been called by God, we have been appointed by Jesus Christ to spread the good news, and we will be expected to report back at some point on what we have done. So when you hear apostle from now on, think ambassador and think about the office and the duties of that office. Third word I want to talk about is baptism, and this is another one of those transliterated words that is very, very important to Christianity, but in the first century didn't necessarily have that Christian meaning. All baptism meant in the first century was to immerse, to completely dip into, in this case, water. But if you were to fry chicken in the first century, for instance, from a secular point of view, you would baptize or immerse that fried chicken. Didn't necessarily have any Christian connotations. So when we're talking about baptism, it literally means to immerse in water, and all of the connotations or all of the symbolism associated with Christ's death came after the fact. So just remember that when Paul or Peter or any of the people in the New Testament are talking about baptism, they are talking about immersion and following the Jewish concept of going down into the mikvah to actually ritually purify themselves. So 3 words: euangelion, apostle, and baptism. Thank you for listening today, and as always, if there's anything that I can do to make this better or more effective for you, please let me know. If you haven't had a chance to watch the video on honor, shame, and the clip from The Godfather, I suggest that you really do that. I think you'll find it entertaining, and also a new way of looking at the Bible and thinking about how Paul had to relate to the people that he worked with in the first century. Now, if you haven't seen the clip, I want to make sure you understand, I'm not saying that Paul was the Godfather. I'm not casting any aspersions on Paul here, but I think that the people he worked with in many cases might have considered themselves the Godfather in terms of the loyalty they expected from Paul if they gave him some sort of gift or benefit. So take a look at that and think about the New Testament maybe just a little bit differently than you used to.